Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. I'd like to welcome back those that were in the Immersive Learning University session that we did in January, as Pat just discussed, and also welcome those who are joining us for the first time today as we discuss this topic about bringing currently existing instructor-led training into, or transforming them into, an e-learning presentation. As we get going, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties here this morning, or this afternoon. I apologize for that. But as we get going into this, I'll very quickly summarize that we discussed in the ILU session there in Charleston, and that is that there's a big misconception, and if you've ever been a part of a transformation process where someone has brought in an existing e-learning curriculum to you and asked you to transform it into an e-learning curriculum, you know that there's a lot of false misconceptions that come into this project because everybody thinks because the course already exists in the world as an instructor-led format, it should be just a simple wave of a hand, throw some magic fairy dust on it, and poof, it becomes an effective and engaging e-learning curriculum almost overnight. And as you well know, that's not the case, especially if you've been involved in ever transforming a course like this before. Into an e-learning format can be a lot more cumbersome than people certainly do understand. And as we go through that, we'll very quickly summarize what we talked about in the ILU portion about how it's not cheap, it's not quick, and it's not easy starting with, because does the course really already exist? I mean, yes, it exists in an instructor-led environment. However, it doesn't really exist for the e-learning platform and the e-learning delivery to the e-learning audience. As we talked about in the session in Charleston, we have a lot different audience, a lot different environment in which they will be taking this course, and therefore we have a lot different needs for both course content, both visual and audio, as well as learner abilities, and we have a lot less control over the environment in which all of these dynamics is going to come into play. So it's really kind of a false misconception to think that just because the course exists for classroom presentation, it really pretty much exists for an e-learning presentation as well. And as we'll go through here, you know, there's a lot of things missing in the e-learning environment that aren't there in the, or that are there, I should say, in the instructor-led environment, starting with the most obvious component. Those of you from Charleston remember we said the biggest, most obvious missing component in the e-learning environment is the instructor facilitator, whereas the visual aids support the instructor in a classroom environment. They are all the presentation, that and the audio that the learner has to focus on in the e-learning environment, because there is nothing else. Their attention is focused, we hope anyway, on the monitor, and there's nothing else. Okay, there's no instructor to fill in the gaps, there's no mock-ups, there's no visual aids and other things hanging around exterior of the monitor that we can rely on to help draw teaching points and to accomplish teaching objectives. We sort of have a WYSIWYG environment, if you will, of what you see is what you get. What's on that screen is going to make or break that teaching objective compared to what we have in the classroom. And we also have to facilitate the environment in which they're able to participate in asking questions of the facilitator. If it's a synchronous environment or an asynchronous environment, either one, we have to provide some connection back into the curriculum and the e-learning environment for further questions, for points they didn't understand, things that might have malfunctioned because of technology, etc., on their end that we may be completely unaware of. And we have to provide plugins and design the plugins of the learner into the system to be able to fill in those gaps, because again, we're not always able to read what their level of engagement, their level of participation is, and we're not always able to vary our presentation accordingly to the audience response. And all of that is compensatable, so to speak, in the e-learning environment. We just have to plan ahead for it and build it in so that it doesn't become a barrier to training. It is actually minimized or eliminated and becomes a facilitator of the e-learning training that is different than what we had in the environment for the classroom environment. As we move on, we also talked about in the Charleston session that basically we have to overcome the paradigm, especially with our course champions, when the project is first brought to us, that, okay, this course already exists in an e-learning environment, so it ought to be a cheap, quick, and easy transition into the e-learning environment. And as you can see from the graphic there on your screen, the transformation process from existing ILT into new e-learning is rarely any one of those three. It's often not cheap, it's often not easy, and it's often not quick. And so we have to start this right out of the chute, so to speak, with both the course champions, the subject matter experts, or the train will get off the tracks very quickly and we'll have a very disastrous project instead of a simple, or I should say, instead of a successful implementation and transformation into the e-learning world. Now, as we go through this presentation, those of you that were in the Charleston presentation heard this. I want to re-emphasize it for you as well as those of you that are joining us for the first time today, and that is that we're not trying to give anyone sticker shock. We're not trying to tell them it's impossible to bring e-learning out of the instructor-led environment or any of those negatives. It's just that we have to properly frame these expectations and these visions, again, to have a successful implementation downstream and avoid a train wreck. So again, our topics for the webinar here will be to deal with champion and subject matter expert paradigms, expectations, key questions to expect from them, and also key questions that as we, the workforce learning professionals, instructional designers, that are going to be project managing this effort and creating this transformed course, we need to ask them to elicit the right information and the right expectations and be able to deliver that. We'll go through, again, some of the pitfalls and concerns in this process. Also, a quick review of cost-benefit analysis. When we talk e-learning, what are we talking about getting the best bang for the buck? How important our kickoff meeting will be with both champions and subject matter experts to get this process started correctly, and how important a process is to follow throughout this whole endeavor, and our roles and responsibilities to both the course champion, the subject matter expert, as well as the process, and to keep it in its integrity going towards a successful conclusion. And whenever we get brought a course that exists in the instructor-led training world and they say, here, turn this into e-learning for us, I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like this little stick figure here in my graphic that I've sort of had a time bomb thrown in my lap, because I know that there's a lot of expectations, paradigms, and false conceptions that I have to overcome, and do so delicately and diplomatically here to make sure that we do keep the train on the tracks and reach that successful outcome. So what we're going to talk about here in the webinar is kind of the what to do's, the what to say's, and what to watch out for as we go through this process. And starting with your courseware champion and SME meeting, that kickoff meeting is ultra critical. I really need to stress that it's very ultra critical what you do at the kickoff meeting and how you do it to either have a successful process and towards a successful conclusion, or you have an absolute train wreck. I mean, the kickoff meeting can really make or break the project. And the reason it has a lot of cautions and pitfalls associated with it is, again, this very common misconception that, well, look, this course already exists. You know, we're just kind of digitizing it and throwing it out there on a server and dispersing it to the web world. So 99% of this is done, and we're just kind of giving it a quick brush over, right? And as you know, if you've been involved in one of these processes before, nothing could really be farther from the truth. That in a sense, we have very much a from-scratch process here, as if we're developing an e-learning product totally from scratch without an existing ILT curriculum or program to deal with. And we have to we have to establish that concept in the minds of our course champions and our subject matter experts right here at the kickoff meeting, or we've really kind of snake bit the project right from the start if we let them leave that meeting with that false conception of this will be quick, easy, and cheap still in their minds. And I'd also like to stress to you that I don't really emphasize so much with people when we're going through this what exactly the courseware development or instructional design process is. Whether you use ADDIE, whether you use the SAM model, whether or not you use rapid prototyping, as much as I would like to emphasize to you that you must have some kind of process that deals with the creation of an e-learning product pretty much from scratch. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to do all steps of that process equally as if it were a from scratch process, but you need to examine it from the get-go at each beginning stage of your process as if it is a from-scratch product to make sure that you're catching all of the things that may have changed from the last update of the e-learning product. For example, different technologies may exist that you want to deploy it with now on the web that would take into account various facilities and functionalities that you need to make up for in the classroom for participation, for engagement, for pause and refreshes and learner engagement and so forth. I would caution you to make no assumptions here as you go through the audience analysis, the needs analysis, etc. Do it like you're starting it from brand new. You know, today in this day and age right here in time, even though this existing instructor-led training is already out there, what might be different about our audience today? What is their abilities with a computer and ability to tie in from various remote locations, whereas we never had to deal with that in an instructor-led environment. We brought them all into the corporate training center, set them down in a nice climate-controlled, brightly lit classroom and so forth, and their level of technology engagement may not have ever even been an issue. And like some of the things I do for the aircraft industry, we have pilots and mechanics and service reps that are located in some fairly remote parts of the world where internet access might be an issue, or their abilities to work with technology might be very new and very limited and very much a beginner status and so forth. So again, make no assumptions at this stage. It may in fact, though, be exactly like it was at the last update of the instructor-led training, and if so, that's fine, but you need to leave no stone unturned just to make sure that nothing has changed, and if something is different, that you account for that in the design of the transformation into the e-learning process. Your design and development of your curriculum is going to be completely different than the instructor-led environment would be. We talked about this some at the ILU, but you know, now you have to account for accessibility issues, language differences, dialect differences, audio, hearing capabilities, bandwidth issues, dial-up versus hopefully not much longer, but it'll be all wireless, internet, etc. And here's a big one, distraction potentials, because now you're not able to control the environment that your e-learning audience is going to be taking the course in nearly to the level of extent that you might have been able to control that in a corporate training center classroom. They might be at home taking this while they're trying to babysit with their children while the wife's away or the husband's away, or they may be in their cube at work where phones try to interrupt and emails try to interrupt and coworkers try to interrupt and disengage them from the learning. And so all of those things have to be taken into account. And here's where we're going to engage our SMEs right in that kickoff meeting and say, okay, we need to come up with some things right at the start here of the design and the development phase that take into account those types of distractions and update this current curriculum in a way that can account for, compensate, and hopefully eliminate those distraction potentials. Then when we get to the implementation phase of the curriculum, obviously it's far different than a classroom because we're doing it on a computer through the web instead of in a classroom with instructors and so forth. But at that point, we need to implement and evaluate not only our curriculum and is it effective, does it accomplish the teaching objectives and so forth, but also does the functionality of the e-learning platform really work? Does it work in a user-friendly, stable, dependable mode? And I would highly encourage you to, at this stage, to test, and retest both your content and also your functionalities and your platform for deployment across the web, just to make sure that you've spent all this money and it doesn't end up going for nothing just because some of the functionality might be limited where you're trying to deploy it, or the user's abilities are limited, or things like that that could really cause you problems. We talked a lot about, in the ILU session, dealing with the course champion. I'm going to very quickly touch on that with some new material today and talk about, as we're first being approached by the course champion about transforming an existing course that's taught in a classroom or instructor-led environment into some kind of e-learning program, let's go back to the old thing of what's in it for me. Let's take a look at that manager or that course champion and say, okay, why do you want this transformed into an e-learning environment? Is there some reason that we need it put into that e-learning format to meet new compliance requirements? Do we have different or more dispersed customers than perhaps we did when we were doing it all in the classroom? Pat talked about the expenses involved in bringing people to an instructor-led environment. Perhaps we're doing this because of the delicate economy and the concerns therein for cost effectiveness, or to increase awareness and improve a safety record that's perhaps been jeopardized by recent accidents, or a whole host of potential motivations from that course champion may exist about why they're wanting to bring it into the e-learning environment. And that's very, very critical that we know that going forward, both the overt agendas as well as maybe any hidden agendas and, you know, things that may be in that, and find out, okay, also when you say, course champion, you want this brought into an e-learning environment, what exactly do you envision an e-learning product of this nature to be? Because as you're well experienced out there as professional training industry people in today's day and age, there's a lot of different technologies that exist for e-learning types of environments. I mean, from as simple as a YouTube video or narrated PowerPoint, all the way up to a full-blown self-directed simulation, you know, real-time multiple participants type of an e-learning deployment can exist. So we need to tune in right up front. Okay, what is it that you're asking me to create? When you say build something, are we building a house, are we building a skyscraper, or are we building a shed in the backyard? We need to know these kinds of dimensions as much as possible right at the outset to make sure that we successfully and efficiently go about this design process. Pat, looks like we have a question from someone.
Yeah, we have a question. I'd like to know, can you speak a little bit to the delivery format, podcasts or formal e-learning, video, audience style? Can you talk a little bit about those?
Yes, I certainly would. A little bit later we'll come to a slide where I cover that, but basically it's a manner of taking a look at what's the right tool for the right job. As an example, recently I was approached again in the aircraft industry for a new type of electronic box was going to be installed in airplanes that was going to kind of dramatically change how the maintenance technician got information about what types of malfunctions might be being experienced by the flight crew. And so we were approached by the SMEs to create some kind of course to raise the awareness, or I should say by the course champions, to raise the awareness about this new radical way, if you will, that this box would relay that information. And the trick to it was that while it was different now, it was going to become so widespread in the manufacturer's product line by the end of the year that its shelf life as a training product was going to basically expire fairly quickly, because the learning curve would be pretty steep. Before long, people were going to be very experienced at dealing with this product. So it would take far longer to develop a detailed how-to course than it would be to just simply create a small webinar, if you will, or a recorded video. We came out with a two-part video that basically just showed an overview of the new functionalities and the new benefits. And so what we did there was we took a look at, okay, the cost involved, the time involved, the shelf life involved of the product, and what was our overall business objective, and that was just simply to raise awareness about the new features and point them to technical publications that would also come out subsequent to the product's installation and delivery to the marketplace. Other things that we've done, like for frequent review of small chunks of technical information, we took a podcast approach or a vodcast approach to that, because we knew a pilot or a mechanic was not going to sit down and look through 66 or 100 pages of technical publication to quickly refresh one area that crossed their mind that they may not be too fresh on the details of that information. So we did a podcast or a vodcast library of those chunks and made it available to them 24/7 for self-directed review and things like that. But definitely, short answer to the question would be try as much as possible within the levels of constraints of cost effectiveness to come up with the right tool for the right learning job would be the delivery platform that I would emphasize. And in that, to tie back into our slide presentation, as the course champion is giving you their vision of, okay, what do I mean when I say I'd like this transformed into an e-learning product? Are we talking a successful e-learning product needing to be synchronous, where the learner would participate in a discussion or a question and answer period live with other learners, having availability of that? Or would it be better in an asynchronous type environment where they could do it anytime, day or night, at their convenience? Again, we spoke of a webinar there or a webcast, so I won't go through that, but perhaps it's something that we could do in not a solely e-learning type format. Perhaps we would need a blended format of either e-learning for a portion and instructor-led for a portion, or synchronous for a portion, asynchronous for a portion, or some virtual training where everybody is participating in a demonstration perhaps of something being performed or done by a facilitator, or a simulation that might affect several game players, if you will, in the same game all around the world or something. So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing cast. And these are the kinds of areas that we need to explore with our champion. And it's been my experience that a lot of times when they say, well, what do you mean by e-learning? Isn't that something you just kind of sit down and watch? I didn't know there were all these other options out there available. And again, then we go back to the cost effectiveness, the time constraints and budget constraints, and what's the best bang for the buck here to the objectives, both business-wise and learning objectives that we're trying to accomplish. And as we go through this analysis with both the champions and now moving into with the subject matter experts, at all times, a good question to keep in everyone's mind is, okay, what does a successful e-learning implementation of this curriculum look like? What does the learner at the other end look like? What skill levels in their profession will they be expecting to have coming into the course? What skill levels dealing with technology will they have coming into the course? For example, if everyone uses the same e-learning platform for all courseware at a given company, I don't necessarily have to develop a tutorial for how to use that software to take this course, because they've also, all their career from orientation forward, have been interacting with that software. If these people are far dispersed, maybe just customers of our company and not actually employees of our company, they may have all kinds of different skill levels technology-wise and with different software platforms. So a brief tutorial of how to use the software and how to participate in the learning may be in order. And then we want to be very cautious of the scope. And it's real easy when you're transforming anything. Those of you that have experience in this, I'm sure, are nodding your heads silently right now, that there's a fine line between updating and transforming from one audience into the other audience of e-learning, and a fine line between that and actual scope creep or scope explosion. So we'd always want to be on guard talking about that, again, gently and diplomatically with the course champion about budget, and say, well, is this a good time for us to expand the scope of the training? Has been a while since that course has been updated. Is there additional features that perhaps you would like to add at this time? Or if we don't have time, we don't have budget, et cetera, then I'm going to need you to help me clearly and concisely define the scope limits here and help us keep everybody within that dimension. Because, again, it's very easy to get outside and experience scope creep. And then you'd want to establish with the course champion, okay, what are the priorities and what are the pain points? This is kind of going back into that what's in it for me. has, for example, a certain plant location experienced a rash of OSHA-related safety incidents, and we have to really increase awareness and so forth and increase the level of safety record in that plant within a given time to avoid further action by the government or things like that. What are those drivers that we absolutely need to take into account right here at the start, and areas of pain that we might need to really emphasize in the training to make sure that it meets that objective of solving that pain point? And of course, the all-important question, how much money do I have to work with and how much time? Those two are always in there, and we need to make sure that we have that firmly established and work within. A good place to begin the analysis and a transformation process into e-learning is just like it is when you're building it from scratch, and that is, okay, let's start with the learning objectives. What do we want the learner to be able to do, and in what environment by the time they're done with this training? Do the existing objectives meet that were used for the instructor-led environment, or do they perhaps need updated? Maybe some are outdated and need removed. Maybe some new requirements have crept in. And maybe because it's an e-learning environment, there are new objectives that need to be factored in here as well. And again, at that kickoff meeting is a good time to bring that seed to the thoughts of the SMEs and say, I'd like you to think about for our next meeting, go back and take a look at this list of objectives that we use currently in the instructor-led class and evaluate that for currency. And imagine yourself sitting at a computer and having to learn this skill from scratch or whatever the environment is. Will these current objectives be able to accomplish that? And of course, you're not throwing it entirely on their shoulders. As an ID professional, you'd be willing to help them with that. But, you know, they need to be thinking of that and generating some at least basic ideas for objectives that you can help them further refine. And then, of course, we'd like to match the delivery format to those expected outcomes using best practices both for the industry and the task being trained, but also best practices for e-learning that may be different, of course, than best practices for instructor-led training. And we talked about that, about what does successful implementation look like. And, you know, it doesn't hurt as an ID every once in a while, too, as you're going through the analysis and the development process, to use that as a good yardstick. Going back through and say, okay, I think we have designed this module, this chunk of training, whatever, to meet this objective, but let's take a look at it through the eyes of what does a successful implementation of a qualified learner look like in comparison to what we've just exposed them to in the training. And I found a lot of times where I think something is very thoroughly developed when I put those lenses on and take a look at it again from the eyes of the learner who is at a given skill level or knowledge level that's perhaps different from the subject matter expert or different from mine. We find that we've left some gaps in there. And so it's always a good double check to use that as a cross-reference periodically in your design. And then the intended outcome. Again, how long is it going to last? Are you just trying to raise awareness? Are you actually trying to build a skill? Do you want to give them practice? All of that's going to determine what it is that you're going to use as a functionality or a delivery platform, like one of you asked there a little while ago. Again, my short shelf life course about a new piece of avionics equipment, what basically amounted to a YouTube video, solved the problem. And we then pointed them to further review on their own as they came up with various specific questions working on it in the technical publications libraries that were going to be available. Other times that may not have been enough, though. If we had the time, we had the budget, we had the critical need and everything, we might have had to actually build a how-to class on how to punch all the buttons and plug in the computer and make it all tell it what they need to tell it. And again, all of that is driven by the intended outcome and the time and the budget that you have to work with. And sometimes a blended approach is a good approach to take. You know, for example, you could send a tech rep who could follow up on your webinar, your webcast, or your e-learning product of whatever form or fashion it was. You could lay the groundwork in e-learning and then send out a tech rep, a sales rep, some other subject matter expert who could 2 months, 3 months, a year later after they've got some experience with it, come in with a follow-on session that might be done in an instructor-led environment, or it might be done in a synchronous e-learning environment where you have the learners all log on and kind of ask some questions. All right, the product's been out in the field now for a little while. You've had a chance to work on it. What issues might you have come up with? What things can you share that you have learned about the product with other learners here in our audience today, and so forth. Again, a blended approach can come in real handy in those kinds of environments. And we take advantage of the anonymity of the internet a little bit there, where people who might feel shy about raising a question or sharing an experience of frustration or mistake that they might have had with a product when they're kind of remotely located from other learners, sometimes tend to be a little bit more forthcoming about sharing that knowledge in a blended synchronous environment that they might not want to share or not feel comfortable sharing with in a instructor-led environment where there's other peers in the room that might put some pressure on them, so to speak. Going into the design of the e-learning product that we're taking out of the instructor-led environment, let's take a look at our terminal objectives at all times of what does a successful outcome of this training look like, and then delve down a little bit into the analysis of the enabling objectives of, okay, how are we going to get them to that point? Are we going to, do this differently than the ILT world? Most likely. And so, therefore, how are we going to go about that? Within the budget and the time frame, what's best format to outcomes? Maybe a level 1 narrated PowerPoint or YouTube video is what we have time and money for, and really that's all we need. Or perhaps we have enough of a situation that we need to accomplish with training. We need something level 2 or 3 with learner direction, some animation, some media, and then again that best design to meet those training objectives, to meet that business goal of accomplishing the business objective with the right tool for that job. In the development phase, storyboarding is every bit as important as we transform an existing ILT course as if we were building it from scratch. I know designers that will use storyboarding as a technique to lay out the course or map the course from start to finish. Also, we have, as we talked about in the ILU presentation, a huge need for graphics in an e-learning environment, way more than we need in the e-learning environment, because again, it's a what you see is what you got. There is no instructor, additional mock-ups, things like that we would have in a classroom to help accomplish teaching objectives. Whatever we're going to do that with is going to be on the screen and through the speakers. So the storyboarding can help provide far more detailed shot lists and video lists and video directions for not only our SMEs to help us develop, but also the vendors that we use for the photographing and videoing and so forth. It also helps us estimate the slide count, the development time, and the cost. And so again, I would be on guard for scope creep as we go through this, because again, there's a very fine line between the necessary updating of a course and where it's actually jumping beyond that into outright scope creep. And beware of the comment of, well, as long as we're doing this, why don't we? And evaluate that by, again, diplomatically with your SMEs and your course champion, challenging them with, okay, is this a must-do to meet these objectives, or is it a nice-to-do to meet the objectives? And either way, do we have the time and the budget to do that with? Also, where we're dealing with languages and dialects and we may not have an interpreter available for some of this, be very careful with the dialect effects. I was in a seminar here recently with a customer, or an instructional designer, who was doing something for a customer in Puerto Rico, and they were using the wrong dialect of Spanish that they were familiar with in Puerto Rico, where certain polite terms became profanities in that dialect of Spanish, and they didn't realize that. It was for a pharmaceutical product, if I remember correctly, and so they had spent a lot of money and time on rework incorporating that updated dialect into their audio and their printed materials. So those are things that we might be able to get away with in the instructor-led environment through using an interpreter who could take all that into account for us, that we have to plan into that as an ID. The bottom line here, just to wrap up, again, as we transform a course out of an instructor-led environment into an e-learning deployment, it's up to us as the instructional designers to coach our champions and our SMEs to successfully frame their visions, their expectations, and the discussions that help evaluate that and design our courseware so that we project manage it effectively into a successful outcome that accomplishes the business and the training objectives and not just another train wreck. And with that, I will turn this back over to Pat if there's any further questions, but I thank you for participating.
We do have one. Question is, what was level 3 of the previous slide?
Level 3 of the previous slide. That probably came a little ways back, right about there. These came from Brian Chapman's website. I mentioned that in the ILU course, but Brian Chapman's website has a really great article out there that he wrote on how long does it take to create e-learning, and it's actually got a really lot of great information about not only time but also cost in creating e-learning environments. And he defined in that a level 1 is a very minimally sophisticated e-learning type of platform, again like a narrated PowerPoint or a YouTube video where there's very little interaction required, you know, kind of a push and play and sit and listen, or maybe advance a slide every now and again type of learner involvement. Whereas level 2 and level 3 start getting into more interaction from the learner with the deployment platform. There's limited or lots amount of learner direction about what order they might go through the content. There's significantly more animations, audio and visual and videography involved in those deployments. And level 3 can go as far as, it could almost be a level 4 in my humble opinion, that, you know, we have like worldwide participation synchronously in a simulation where there's multiple players with multiple consequences all going on in a real-time environment. But again, www.chapman.com, I believe, is his web address. But if you look under Brian Chapman e-learning, you'll probably get to his website as easily. I don't have it right in front of me now, but that's where it's all very well defined. And I hope that answered your question.
Dave, I think as we work together on a lot of the projects we've worked together, you touched on this about being important. I think it's really a good thing to stress on. Again, to mention again is just the audience. Know who you're creating this for. You can have a great instructor-led course, and if all of the charisma is with the instructor and not the content, and you try to take that content and turn it into an e-learning course, then you are not going to have a good e-learning course. And so if you know the audience, you can take that content and take the charisma, from the instructor and put it into the content and know who you're targeting. If you have your learners need to have the extra graphics, the kind of the visual elements to really get their attention, work that in. If you need to have the engagement, really get them in there, and the higher level, put in the branching, let them get in there and play with the information. If you have you brought up the course you worked on where you had a lot of short video elements where the learners could get in there and get just what they need, exactly what they need at the time they need it, see the little video element component, and then get out. Get what they need, get in, get out. So I think it's really critical to understand your audience when you're going through and translating, converting, whatever you want to call it, creating your new course from your existing instructor-led course.
Excellent points, Pat. Yeah, because the last thing you want to do is go through all this effort and expense and to have it flop with the learner audience and miss those objectives, both business-wise and teaching objectives. Excellent points. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions anyone would like to ask right now? All right, well, great. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Just to mention that David's ILU PowerPoint deck is available on the ILU website right now. So you can go to immersivelearninguniversity.com and pull that down, look at that. We will soon have this webinar available and this PowerPoint deck available shortly. So please check back and you'll be able to see this information. I think we do have one more comment. Just one second. The question is, do you use any service level agreements with internal clients?
I'm not sure what we're talking about by service level agreements, but with internal clients, what we try to do is get them to commit to a process document that we have created, especially within our company, that outlines the process in which we will follow and the level of expectations of both the subject matter experts as well as the ID team, and try to get their buy-in, so to speak, and their level of involvement and what we're going to expect from them as we go through this process and what they can expect from us. And we have that kind of defined by a from-scratch project, a transformation project, and also various levels of depth and scope that we're going through, and try to identify that at the kickoff meeting and get everybody to sign off or buy in on it, if that answers that question.
We have another question. Where the mini videos that you were talking about, where do you store those?
We actually have our own internal website for e-learning, and we just put them out there as a library function. We have a tab that's basically available to them based on the type of product that they're looking for, and if there's a library available, we just put that as a link off of that product, and so they can go in and review those in the library for that specific product.
And going back about the agreements that the question you had earlier, do you have any templates that you use for that, service level agreements?
Actually, no. We had to develop it from scratch. We looked around for some, but we weren't really convinced that they went to the level of depth and the vastness, if you will, of what we were facing, because we have certain regulatory requirements in the aircraft industry that we have to be very cognizant of, and we use respective terms that try to reflect that. And so we basically took a few basic templates, but we abandoned them pretty quickly as we tried to model ours, and just basically expanded it into a much larger document that was custom written.
And along those lines, do you have any tips for keeping SMEs dedicated through the project?
Yeah. Actually, you know, there's a great book that the ASTD organization has out there called SMEs from the Ground Up. And one of the things that that book recommends is that you try to have a fairly vast list of SMEs on a project so as to not overtask any one person. Now, of course, that's going to vary on the level of depth of the knowledge that you're trying to convey. But if a SME starts to feel like they're really getting put upon, things start to really kind of go south real quickly, so to speak. In other words, a lot of times, and this is one of the things that we talk about with course champions before we ever get to that kickoff meeting, so I'm glad somebody brought this up, be it a from-scratch project or a transformation project, we try to discourage the SME in a given area being the most expert person on that within the whole company that we're dealing with, because that's usually the go-to person for everything within that group, department, division, or whatever. So that person's already pretty task saturated. And now here, if we come in and start asking for an hour and a half to 3.5 hours a week of their time, they're already in a jammed up full schedule. Now this is really starting to be pretty cumbersome for them. So we're not looking for a rookie, but we're also not looking for the absolute expert either. We try to get a middle-of-the-road person, and with the champion and the department manager's encouragement, okay, who out there is competent in the field, will be willing to say they don't know something, but they'll take it upon themselves to go research it further, but they know enough to at least get us started and could possibly point us in the direction of another person, perhaps that most knowledgeable person, for just a brief bit of their time. But that's one thing I would say about engagement, is being very cognizant of the SME's time and trying not to be a burden as much as possible. And then with that right SME for the job, then give them realistic expectations up front of what you expect of them per week, per month, by the end of the project, so it doesn't take them totally by surprise and really jam up their schedules even worse.
We know there's a lot of challenges, but what would you say is typically the biggest challenge you find converting pre-existing ILE content into engaging e-learning material?
Budget and time. Again, the misconception that it's quick, cheap, and easy. You have to really break down that paradigm, and it's doable. Again, we're not trying to give anybody sticker shock or convince them it's impossible, but that's really probably the biggest elephant in the room. is just getting everyone on the same page that this will take some time, this will take some money. It really isn't a fully developed for the e-learning world because it exists in the classroom down the hall.
Okay, we have time for one more, and it is, what about assessment afterward? You can do post-assessment, but measuring engagement afterward. How do you address that?
That's a great thing to do. Have a lessons learned meeting after every project, and bring people in from the course champion to the SMEs to the vendors, anybody you want. You can make that lessons learned meeting in as deep a scope as you could possibly feel comfortable doing it. And you don't have to have everybody in the same room at the same time, but just say, okay, what did we do right? What did we do that didn't go so well? What could have made it more convenient for you, less frustrating for you, more cost effective? All those parties address their concerns and try to elicit from them what worked and what didn't work so well and go forward with those lessons learned. You'll find a lot of times that your SMEs are willing to help function as a subject matter expert on how the process goes just as easily as they are on how to actually give the content, because they want to make their lives easier in case you come back and ask them to do something the next time. Great questions.
Great, Dave. That's unfortunately we're out of time right now. I know we still have a few that we did not address, but if anyone would like to carry on this conversation afterward, via email or phone, anything, we will be available. So just you can shoot me an email and we can get back with you and schedule something. My email is pmileham@nextlearn.com. Just shoot me an email and I'll get back with you, and either someone at NextLearn or we'll bring in Dave here and we'll get back with you and keep this conversation going. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and please look forward for the next webinar session. We will be sending out shortly some information on that, and we hope to talk with you again.
Thanks, everyone.